Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. Susan Gold is amazing. She's navigated untold bumps in life, started a successful star-studded business matching famous people with the advertising industry, and most of all, she's pursued a life in search of stunning authenticity. She freely shares her story in her book, Toxic Family: Transforming Childhood Trauma into Adult Freedom. Please welcome Susan Gold to Bump in the Road. Susan, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Well, first, I just want to say I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm mesmerized by what you've created. This platform is exquisite and much needed in our universe, especially at this time. So my bump in the road started close to my birth. I was shot into a chaotic family system with an alcoholic papa, and my mother self-soothed with eating, compulsively overeating. And back then they prescribed diet pills, which were straight speed, which I discovered in my 20s. So the platform was not stable. And though my mother was incredibly loving, she could flip on a dime. I think she had some personality issues, some mental health issues, and I could be beaten for what I didn't understand. So I wanted to escape that big bump in the road as quickly as possible. I was highly empathic, meaning I could feel the tenor, the tone, the flavor, and I was even telepathic until it became too dangerous. And I just dreamed of escape, which was usually downstairs in the basement on my beanbag chair on my belly, watching Barbara Walters, the famous journalist who did some great interviews with some celebrities later on and created The View. And I just wanted to get to New York City and be like Barbara Walters. And so on I went. I graduated from high school at 17, and the morning after I graduated, I ended up in New York City and went again to New York City after I graduated from college to live there. And I worked in a very glitzy, glamorous sky-rise building in the entertainment industry at an agency called ICM, but they didn't pay me enough to meet my bills. So I created a side hustle, training people in exercise, and Barbara Walters became one of my first clients. And one morning I knocked on Barbara's door at 7 a.m. and she answered, and she took one look at me and she said, "Susan, get in here. What's going on with you?" And she got it out of me within moments. I'd been sexually harassed in the workplace the day before. And she said, "I'm coming to work with you and we're going to address this gentleman together." And I said, "That's okay, Barbara. I think I've got this one covered." And I did address my boss that day, and he promptly fired me. I was newly sober because all the red flags that had come up in my own family of origin were coming up now in my early 20s in my own life. The same things that I said would never happen. The drama in the relationships, drinking to cover my feelings, all sorts of addictions popping up, my life getting smaller and smaller, and me losing sight of my goals. So here I was, newly sober. I had just extricated myself out of an abusive relationship where the gentleman held the purse strings, I'm ashamed to say. And I was going to survive. I was going to get through this bump in the road no matter what. And even though Barbara offered me an assistantship for her then fiance, who was running a huge film distribution company, I knew I could be an assistant no longer. So I launched my own talent brokerage firm, matching celebrities to brands because it's similar to what I had been doing. And my first deal was to knock on the door of the factory and convince Andy Warhol to do a commercial he didn't want to do. It was one abused child speaking with another silently. And those dogs meant everything to him, Pat. And he would cradle them in his arms. And there I was yammering on about this commercial spot. And finally he looked at me and he said, "Now, really, why should I do this?" And I said, "Because you can have the pugs in the shot with you." And I didn't know if that was true or not, but it got him to say yes. And it launched me into a career where I was matching celebrities to brands and meeting wonderful people. And that led me into producing for television and film. But it didn't get me around those bumps in the road that were already created. And by addressing alcoholism, my predilection to suicidal ideation and clinical depression came up, and I had about a 10-year tussle with that. And ultimately, I had to face narcissistic abuse, which I would say was my perfect storm. I had moved from New York to LA for what I thought was a great career move, and it was. And I was now producing for television. And I met the man of my dreams, but really he was the man who would become my greatest guru when we went through a horrendous divorce.
Why is it we learn the most from the people who hurt us the most?
I think I've signed some kind of nebulous lifelong contract before I came in and agreed to allow these challengers and these challenges to wake me up to opportunities of soul evolution. Because to that point, Pat, I was living well on the outside. It all looked so good. And I even was living well with some kind of self-examination and self-realization on the inside. I was a long-term meditator. I was exploring. I've been clean since before you were born in the 80s and stayed clean for decades. But it just took a big billboard, a big fat billboard, like my divorce, to fall on my head, to wake me up to the fact that I was living from the outside, gaining accolade after accolade according to societal standards, but feeling more empty and empty on the inside, trying to placate my fear of abandonment. And it was really this gentleman, my ex-husband, who woke me up. And it was a year of excruciating bump in the road. I'd say elephant in the middle of the living room, now being exposed. He chose not to leave the home I had bought and paid for and maintained for our family while the divorce was going on. He took up residence in the master. And I, by choice, took a mattress across our home and set up shop in a partial conversion in our garage. And it became my monastery. I spent a year going inward with somatic forms of therapy, meaning, that talk therapy, those modalities, they were helpful for getting the storyline down, but I really needed to go into those pockets of trauma and explore them deeply. Old pockets of emotion that were closed in their carefully concealed compartments.
I think that's true, though, for all of us. I think until we address the underlying emotional energy, nothing gets resolved. You can intellectually understand it, but you have to emotionally put yourself back in that place to dissolve it.
It's certainly been true for me. And it's been the greatest awakening of my lifetime because I did try to get it from a mental angle. And it led me square back to the same starting point that I had launched when I first got sober and worked with a therapist. And though that storyline is important, it's much more important for me to release the trauma, release the emotions, and get rid of that incredible fear that's been leading me, that's been guiding me to uncover the layers of duct tape and Gorilla Glue that made a fortress around my bleeding heart. And finally, to see that spark of light and not just see it, but feel it and let that spark of light that's inside my heart, I call it the piece of soul that came along for the ride, that little girl, that little Susie that's been through all of this with me, to let her take the lead and for me to finally surrender and listen to her, because she's a much better guide.
Surrender is such a common theme in these stories. It's like life just has to beat us down to a point where we're willing to surrender. But once you're at that point, it's also an opportunity to start to rebuild and to choose what you bring back into your life. Don't you think?
You just touched upon the freedom. That's it exactly. I used to begrudge these life lessons, and going through what I've experienced has put me into a new zip code where I see this muck, this challenge when it comes up. Okay, here's another opportunity to grow and evolve. Because every time I've gone through it or allowed myself to, with as much love as I can muster, it's led me to such a magical place that I didn't know existed. It's literally taken me to experiencing heaven here on earth.
Talk about that. Give an example.
There are many. There are many. I have to go back to the greatest lesson. I mean, how many people call their ex-husband their greatest guru? We're not in touch now, and I wouldn't want to be in his body for any money in the world. But here I was wondering, was I going to be able to keep this beloved home that I had sweat blood over to secure for our family? Was I going to be able to keep it? Was I, the injustice of this scenario seemed so real. And each time I would delve into it, I would have to say, you've got to trust this is going to bring you to a better place. I mean, he left and I wrote him his 6-figure check. He was on to his next source of supply, and I was left with the demolition. But ultimately, I took that house almost down to the studs. That little garage monastery became an income suite that paid half my mortgage, my taxes, and my insurance. And miracles like that kept repeating. My life got more expansive. I was finally unwinding the barbed wire that was faced inward. And I was much more free to live as lusciously and to start to feel as deeply as life could bring on. And if I didn't have challenges like that, I wouldn't have these opportunities. I wouldn't.
I know one of my mantras later in life has become, what can I learn? Whenever I hit a bump, what can I learn? And it's always about, what can I learn about myself?
Regardless of the circumstances,
Yeah.
Which sometimes feel extremely harsh. I mean, most people don't understand how living through a childhood like I did, how I'm functional at this point. And that childhood gave me a lot of pluses. I'm quite independent. I'm quite capable. I have a depth of compassion that's almost surreal. And it is an incredible place to get to when you can see life's circumstances in that way. So much of my life was spent trying to control future outcomes that weren't even near, that didn't even come into play, but kept me tied into almost like an automaton way of living.
Oh, control is such an interesting issue, isn't it? I mean, I think we all want to control our environment, but the reality is we don't even control ourselves. Or as I say, at best, on a good day with a tailwind, we might control ourselves. But control, it's an illusion. It's a total illusion. And yet it's an illusion that controls us. It's just incredible.
It's so perfectly coiffed and placed. And I'm thrilled to be able to have experience to crack that control, break it right open. It's an incredibly vulnerable place to visit and to live from. But it's being truly authentic and really experiencing my life ride for what I believe it truly is.
And I think part of letting go of control is being intensely present in the moment, because you're not projecting into the future. You're not looking back necessarily with control, but the more present you can be, the more, I think, rich and light and meaningful your life becomes, because that's where you live. You live in the present. You don't live in, if you live in your mind, you're not here. And control, of course, is in your mind.
I mean, decades ago, there's no way that I could sit in this stool now and have this conversation with you, Pat, because I'd be so busy trying to answer your next question. And today I feel engaged. I feel present. I really am listening to what you're saying, which is so brilliant. You have such great wisdom that you've garnered, and it's so beautiful. And the fact that you share it so openly with your listeners and now with me in our conversation, it's such a gift. It's such a gift of being through the challenges that we've both been through.
Well, and I think the thing that I find interesting, at least, is when I hit a bump, it's an opportunity, sometimes a painful one, but an opportunity to peel away another layer and look at what is most authentic for me. I hit a bump recently that really threw me off my game for about 3 months. I was in a situation where somebody knifed me in the back, twisted the knife, and pulled the rug out from underneath me, and then refused to engage in any dialogue. And what really got me about this wasn't the event. They were unconscious in terms of what they did. They did this again and again to many people. But I was so angry. And I saw my face on a Zoom call, and I was horrified at how twisted and angry and ugly it was, frankly. And I just looked at myself, and I realized I had to deal with whatever was setting me off, because I would not allow this kind of energy to govern my reactions or my future.
And that's the sign of an evolved soul. I mean, so many times when I have to go back in, I mean, as a young adult, realizing I really didn't have a childhood. And now I was going to have to go dive back in and create one, and now mop up the mess and be responsible. Oh, it was so aggravating. It just felt so unjust and unfair. But if anybody would have told me at the time the kind of freedom and rich living, engaged living, comfort in my own skin, this earthly body that we get, if I had any idea, oh my gosh, I would have dove in much more wholeheartedly. I probably would have been looking for those circumstances and situations.
Well, I always say that the first half of our life just heaps all sorts of crap upon us. And the second half of our life, if we're lucky, we start to peel off all these layers of hardened nonsense that have, just stuck to us. And in doing that, we start to find out who we really are.
Yeah, and the faulty belief systems for
Yes.
me have
For
been,
everybody.
stripped away one by one. And I'm so grateful. What a privilege.
Do they ever, do our faulty belief systems, even when we recognize them, do they ever fully disappear? Or are we just more aware?
I don't think I would be the person I am if they completely disappeared. Sometimes I would like that. I would like the magic eraser. Thank you very much. But they have made me the individual that I am, the human being that I am. They have cracked my heart open with compassion.
In your book, you write about a period in your life where you say, after decades of push, and then pushing some more, I was finally halted. Running marathons, completing triathlons, including escape from Alcatraz, and working insatiably to become a nationally ranked U.S. Masters swimmer in less than 4 years, ended in my barely being able to make it around my block. You were in excruciating pain, and it was just a terrible situation. Talk about surrender, my gosh. How did you navigate through something like that?
It was really tough. And it was about a year after my divorce that this transpired. I was an exercise addict. I used exercise like heroin, and I knew it, but I didn't want to face it. And literally I was achieve, and just so loved it. And that was another false identity that the universe is like, sorry. And literally I could not walk around the block. And literally it was to get into the bathtub, to get into the car. Oh, it sounds like the time you went to the physician when you were being diagnosed and it was just so horrendous to even move. And then the physician wasn't even there for the appointment. But it was just another identity that I really needed to drop because I was being brutal to my own physicality, to my own body. I was replicating the behavior that was demonstrated in my family home, but now I was doing it to myself. I can't tell you how many times I got up at 4 a.m. to jump in a frigid, cold pool. Southern California sounds warm and sunny, but during the winter months, it can be 38 and the pool water can be 74, and it's not pleasant. Just mushing myself on, running copious amounts and biking. And then the mandate to perform, achieve. And I'm glad ultimately that was stripped away because I had no thermostat for self-care when it came to exercise and achievement. I was using my body like a worn out tool. And if I didn't have that experience, I wouldn't be in the place now where I can say, wow, do I feel like a walk this morning or do I need some gentle stretching? That was not in my vocabulary. And it's such a delicious place to actually find.
Losing your identity, though, is very hard. I've been through several losses of identity, and it really strips you down to whatever is underneath that facade that you're presenting to the world.
Yeah, so we find out that it is only a facade. Who really am I in there? Who am I in relation to others? What can I bring today rather than take away? How can I help someone else feel connected and comfortable? How can I help soothe? How can I bring light to this dark situation? It's the antithesis of what we're schooled in. But I feel like it's the evolution that's happening, especially now with the raising of vibration and frequency and us waking up to these antiquated systems that have not been working for decades. There's real hope here.
They're horribly antiquated. We live in a left-brained world that has this prescribed course. You go to school, you get the job, you buy the house, you have the kid, whatever is on your prescription path. And we really negate our right brain capabilities, which I think are so much more creative and interesting and exploring oriented. And I think that the truth lies somewhere in between. But it isn't until people hit, say, midlife or so, and they're so burnt out that they realize they have no right brain life or very little. And I think that's a real failing in our system.
I'm hoping that kids today coming up are seeing it. I mean, I can only speak for my son. His roommate was double majoring, double minoring. They're trained to think a specific way. They can't get out of the trowel. I see it with interns that I work with. They're terrified to have a creative thought. It may not be acceptable or okay. I mean, you and I, we escaped it. You went to Wharton Business School. I mean, that's incredibly stringent and restrictive. We've broken out of it, but I feel like the young generations are going to break out of it too before they even get too ingrained. That's my hope anyway. And certainly the new ones that are being born now.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think so. I think that for any of us that are in touch with our souls, we realize at a point that there has to be a more expansive, cooperative, win-win way to approach things. At least that's how I look at it. And I realize I bump my head into this all the time. Other people do not see things that way. I get it. But it's the way I choose to navigate life.
I think that's why we're here. to bring that new and fresh perspective. Certainly you have with all you're doing. I feel like that's what I've been called to do. I mean, my life was very glittery working as a producer, matching celebrities to brands and all that kind of thing. But I feel now I'm finally fulfilling my purpose, my mission to radiate to others peace, to show compassion, to show how we can allow our challengers to be forgiven and to move forward and through and find real freedom.
Now, you're up in Montana now, aren't you?
I am. The universe reassigned me. I had no idea it was going to happen. Montana was not even on my bucket list. And after spending decades in New York City and then LA, I'm absolutely in heaven on earth here. But yeah, I plan to stay in Southern California at least till my son graduated college and got sorted. But I was called. Yeah.
What led you to Montana?
I had a friend who lived in Montana and she kept encouraging me. And then things were happening that weren't making me very comfortable. They installed a 5G tower on my neighbor's curb and my dog started acting funny at a certain time in the afternoon. And they were going to tell me my solar panels were going to be cost prohibitive now to run. They were lobbying me to create the solar panels, and then they were going to be cost prohibitive to run if the governor passed certain regulations. And then there were rumors that the capital gains tax was going to be doubled. So if I sold my home, it'd be pretty difficult to buy one elsewhere, even though I lived in Southern California. And I just took this as, hey, it's a sign to check around other locations. And I really wanted to go to West Virginia, to Greenbrier County. I had been on a film junket for Fox, and we went to the Greenbrier, and I just thought it was so beautiful. And there was actually an incentive program to go to West Virginia. And I went, but it just didn't have that right feel. And that's something that I connected with going through all my bumps in the road that I have. I trust my feelings. I trust my intuition to lead me now more than ever. And so my friend kept encouraging me, and I said, okay, I'll come to visit in mid-January because I didn't want any bloom off the rose. I wanted to see Montana in wintertime. And where she lived wasn't for me, but she told me the name of a little town in the northwest corner, about 4 miles from the Canadian border. And as soon as she said the name, I was like, that's for me. And I wasn't even halfway up the 2-lane road that goes in and out when I knew, oh, I'm meant to be here and I'm on beautiful sacred land. It's prairie country. I thought if you moved to Montana, you moved to the forest. What's the point of living on the prairie? But I am surrounded in the most incredible divine nature. It is stunning here, and it's quite healing. And I feel like I've been led here to do the work that I have been led to do with clarity and with comfort. And I feel the expansiveness of this terrain, and I feel how it's working on my soul, opening me more and more, Pat.
Following your intuition takes guts in this world, but I think it's the only way to go.
Absolutely. I wish I would have done it earlier. I mean, I was so intuitive as a young one, and until I really shut it down, because it got me into trouble, expressing what I was sensing and intuiting. It really has come back since 2020, I think, when things started to get quieter. I had to start going within more. And now I'm at a point where I don't have a choice. It's uncomfortable, some of the things that are happening in the global world. And in order to handle the energies, especially as a super empath, I mean, there's rarely a morning that I wake up where I'm not feeling some ominous sense of doom or fear. And what I've learned is it's not always mine. It can belong to the global collective. So really going within and trusting that intuitive voice that's got quite loud as I've been meditating more and more is something that's of value and something I can trust.
Thank you for listening. I hope you'll support this podcast by becoming a Bump 2 subscriber. Buy us a cup of coffee. It's your support that makes this podcast and website possible. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life.